reminder, if you did not know, October is Pastor Appreciation Month. So if you haven't had the opportunity to love on our pastors recently, please take that opportunity. I mean, Matt and Carrie do so much for this church, make so many sacrifices for this church. There are pastors that are out there driving around in their Rolls Royces and flying in their private jets and living in their 10,000 square foot houses. That's not Matt and Carrie. They make so many sacrifices for us, many that we don't see. So we've got about 4 days left in October. If you haven't had the opportunity, please love on your pastors in the next 4 days. So as Matt says, I have the honor over the next 3 weeks to close out our Gospel of David series. And in this series, we've been looking at the life of David and really evaluating and seeing how his life and much of the Old Testament has been a foreshadow to Jesus Christ. And as we've looked at David's life, we've really seen a man that has been very anointed by God. Every step of the way, we see David, whether it was being anointed to become the king of Israel, whether it was the way he fought Goliath, whether it was the way he dealt with Saul and eventually becoming king, we see a man who undoubtedly fulfilled the law and did it with a zeal and a passion that was like no other. And yet, when we step back and look at the 10,000-foot view of David's life, it almost looks like a bell curve. Up to this point, it's been the rise of David, and everything he has done has been blessed by God. But today, we see David at the peak. We see a man who, through all this glory and honor and success, lets it go to his head, lets it become less about Yahweh and more about him. And we see David at the peak beginning to fall in this bell curve. And so this morning, we're going to dig into a challenging topic. As Matt said, this is really 3 weeks. So today, I'm going to throw a really tough topic out at you as we look at the life of David. But it doesn't end today. Really, we're going to look at David's life and this event over the next 3 weeks. So I encourage you, come back over the next 2 weeks so that you're not left depressed today. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up with me to 2 Samuel chapter 11. We're going to dig into that. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one there in the pew right in front of you. 2 Samuel 11 could be found on page 262 of that Bible. And we're gonna look at this passage, and there's really 5 different scenes that happen here. And so we're going to take each one, pick it apart, and see what's going on in David's life. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, page 262 in the Bible there, and we'll start in verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So winter was typically a time where war ceased, and springtime was now upon them. And so David was sending his army back into war. We've read in the previous few chapters that they've been having great success against the Ammonites. And really, the size and the power of the army of Israel had gotten to a point where David didn't have to go to war. When armies were either young or they didn't have strong leadership, the king would often go to battle to fight. And in this case, though, the army of Israel had gotten to a point where David didn't have to do that. And that was preferred because you didn't want your king going to battle and potentially risking death. So the setting here is that springtime is upon us, the nation of Israel is going back to war, and David's chilling back at the palace. Verse 2. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David wakes up from his afternoon siesta. Typical Palestinian afternoon is pretty warm, and the best place for him to cool off was on the roof of the palace. So he's up just walking around, and he sees this woman bathing from afar. Now, obviously, this was a time where we didn't have running water. We didn't have bathrooms. So people often had to go to take a bath somewhere. There was the public bathing area. If you were lucky enough and you were wealthy enough, maybe you had a tub sitting in your property, but if not, you had to go to the public bathing area. And that's what Bathsheba was doing. And a woman would typically bring her husband with her for a bit of privacy, but as we're going to find out, Bathsheba's husband was out at war. But nonetheless, there was a moral code. You weren't a peeping Tom. You didn't go watching the women taking a bath. Yet David was completely enamored by the beauty of this woman. And so he takes one of his servants and he says, go find out for me, who is this woman? And this is what he would have found out. Her grandfather was one of the most trusted councilmen for Israel and most likely the king. David, like any president or any ruler of a nation, had strong councilmen that would give them counsel and help them understand the state of war, the state of the union. And so Bathsheba's grandfather was one of these men. So David probably interacted with him often. Her father was one of David's mighty warriors. Matt talked about David's mighty men, these 30 or so men that as David began to find himself in battle, who were by his side and were strong warriors that helped him win battle after battle. So David knew her father really well. And her husband, Uriah the Hittite, was fighting in David's army at this very moment. So it's very likely David knew who Bathsheba was. He often interacted with her grandfather, her father, and he knew who her husband was. You know, I equate Bathsheba to, if you ever, when you grew up, you had that family friends that weren't really relatives, but were distant, close enough that you called them cousins or aunt and uncle. I think that's who Bathsheba was to David. He watched her as she grew up, and he interacted with her grandfather, her father, and her husband, so he kind of knew who she was. Maybe saw her as that adopted niece or that adopted daughter. And so what does David choose to do? Verse 4. So David sent message and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanliness. Then she returned to her house. There's a ton of scholarship that's written about this passage. Did David use his power to bring her to the castle or to the palace? Did Bathsheba entice David by bathing out in the open? Were they co-conspirators in what happened here? And I think when we look at the broader narrative of what's happening here in 2 Samuel 11, it's pretty clear as to what happened. And I'm going to steal a quote from a professor, Richard Davidson. He says this: there are indeed biblical references to women who seduce men and receive divine condemnation. Example, the immoral woman of Proverbs 1 through 9. And to women who commit sexual immoral acts together with men and together are indicted by God. Deuteronomy 22. But the account of Bathsheba is not such a reference. This narrative concerning Bathsheba and King David represents an indictment directed solely against the man and not the woman, against David and all men in positions of power, whether civil or ecclesiastical or academic, who take advantage of their power and victimize women sexually. Power rape receives the strongest possible theological condemnation in this narrative. We would consider this Bathsheba's modern-day Me Too movement. We would put David in the same category as the likes of Sylvester Stallone, Jamie Foxx, Morgan Freeman, R. Kelly, Matt Lauer, Tom Brokaw, Harvey Weinstein, Charlie Rose, Ryan Seacrest, James Franco, Michael Douglas, Mario Battelli, Danny Masterson, James Levine, Garrison Keillor, Richard Branson, Al Franken, Louis C.K., Dustin Hoffman, Andy Dick, Kevin Spacey, Ben Affleck, and the list goes on and on. Men who used their power to sexually assault a woman, some going even as far as raping them. That's what David did here. He was a man of power. You didn't say no to the king. Now the narrative doesn't tell us, was there a struggle? Did he force himself upon her? We don't know any of that. But what we do know is that David used his power to have sex with Bathsheba, a woman who he knew was married. He knew who she was. David could have had any single woman in all of Israel, but he chose to take this woman and rape her. And so what happens? Verse 5. And the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. This is why it was important in verse 4 that we knew she was cleansing herself from her monthly cycle. Biology tells us, that being the case, she wasn't pregnant. Her husband was off at war, and she now becomes pregnant. There's no doubt in this passage that the child is David's. And so Bathsheba's recognizing that her body's changing, and something's going on. And she realizes she's pregnant, and she sends word back to the king. Because she understood, based upon Levitical law, Leviticus 20, the very act of them having sexual relations outside of their marriage, they were both worthy of death. And she couldn't hide it now. Can you imagine the anxiety that Bathsheba was going through? Going back, telling the king, recognizing that he could have hung her out to dry. He could have had any servant that saw her come into the palace completely quieted, and he could have denied the fact that it even happened. And then when her husband comes back from war, she had to explain to him how she got pregnant. And so she sends word to David to let him know what has happened and to let him know that she's pregnant now with his child. And as we've seen over these last 5 weeks, David was a very resourceful man in the face of adversity. He always had a plan on how to handle situations, and this was no different. And his plan, in his mind, was simple. He would bring Uriah back from war. He would have him spend an evening with his wife, then go back to war. 9 months later, Bathsheba gives birth, Uriah is ecstatic, and David's completely off the hook. But what really happens? Scene 2, verse 6. So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. So David's standing in front of the man whose wife he just raped and impregnated. I mean, you would hope that there was some guilt that he was feeling. He starts with small talk. How's the war? How's Joab? How you doing? And Uriah was probably completely baffled. I mean, David had messengers that would come back and forth from the battlefield every single day and give him updates. And Uriah's probably wondering, why? Why did you send me back from the war? I was in the middle of fighting for our country. Why are you asking me these simple questions? And David says, "Go home, be with your wife." And then David goes even as far as sending him a gift. If you've ever been in like a honeymoon suite or an anniversary suite and they know it's your honeymoon, they set out the champagne and the chocolate-covered strawberries. And so David's sending him some Barry White music and saying, hey, go home and be with your wife and have a good time. It was probably a pig or a roast or something like that. But he's trying to set the mood for David and Uriah and for Bathsheba and Uriah to have an intimate evening. But as we're going to see, Uriah was a man of character. So what does he do? Verse 9. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go to his house, David said to Uriah, "Have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." Have you ever seen those pictures on Facebook of the dogs or typically a dog that is laying by the casket of, many of the ones that I've seen are people that come back from war and die in war, and the pets are laying on the casket because they're so loyal to their owner. I've shared when I preached in the past, when I was 14, I had an older sister who was 15 that was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and over the next 10 years fought a battle before eventually passing away. And over those 10 years, she got physically handicapped and then eventually mentally handicapped. And about 2 years after my sister got sick, we got a dog named Misty. Misty was a border collie mix, and Misty absolutely loyal to my sister. When my sister got to the point where she couldn't climb upstairs, she would sleep downstairs because that's where the bathroom was, and Misty would sleep right by the couch next to her. When my sister would have to get up and wheel herself to the bathroom, Misty would follow behind. As my sister was in the bathroom, Misty would sit right there waiting for her to come out. As she was coming back, she would follow her back. If my sister ever fell, Misty would start barking uncontrollably. When my sister died, we took Misty into the funeral home, and she would not even look at my sister. This is the type of loyalty Uriah had. He was a man that understood that there was a war going on. He understood that Deuteronomy said that if he went home to be with his wife, he all of a sudden became unclean and couldn't go back to war for several days. And so David's asking him, why? Why didn't you go home to be with your wife? You've traveled so far. And his response is, the ark is out in battle. What he's saying is that there's a battle going on, and I need to go out and fight for Yahweh. He says, my fellow countrymen, my fellow soldiers are sleeping in tents. They don't get to go home and be with their wives. How can I go home and be with my wife? And then he looks at the king and he says, surely as you live, as your soul lives, I can't go home and be with my wife. His loyalty to David, to his country, to his fellow soldiers was so strong, he was not going to go home and be with his wife. So David's like, okay, but he continues to push. He continues to push. In verse 12, then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him, and he ate in the presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on the couch with the servants of the Lord again, but did not go down to his house. So David tries to push it even further. All right, you're not going to go home and be with your wife? Come to the palace. Let's drink. Let's eat. If I get you drunk, we all know what happens when someone gets drunk. Maybe, hopefully, you'll go home and be with his wife. But again, Uriah's commitment to his God, to his country, to his king, and to his fellow countrymen proved too strong. He would not do that. And at this point, we need to step back and really compare and contrast the character of these two men. You see, David was the representation of Israel. As the king, he represented the law, he represented Yahweh, and his job was to uphold justice in the name of Yahweh. And here he is, covering up his sin, doing everything he possibly can to get this man to go home and be with his wife so he can get out of doing what he had done. And then we contrast that with Uriah the Hittite. And 5 times in this passage, Uriah is referred to as the Hittite. And that's an important note, because when the children of Israel took over the promised land, God told them to wipe out any of the nations that were there. He didn't want them intermingling with these nations, but they didn't do that. And the Hittites were one of those nations. And so we know that Uriah isn't even a true Jew. He's not truly of the household of God. He married Bathsheba, intermingling their nationality. And so he's not truly of the faith, yet here he is, a man who's showing the character of what it means to represent Yahweh. And we see this huge contrast, that David, a man of the faith, a man who represented Yahweh, doing everything he possibly can to cover up his sin, while Uriah the Hittite is doing everything he possibly can to uphold his commitment to Yahweh. So this leads us to our third scene. And verse 14 says, in the morning, David wrote a letter. You can imagine how much David slept that night. His plot had failed. He was trying to figure out what possibly could he do to cover up his sin. In verse 14, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. So David continued his plan. Uriah wasn't going to go home and be with his wife, and so he had a choice. Does he confess his sin and potentially lose his kingdom, his kingship, possibly his life? Or does he continue to figure out how does he cover up his sin? And David, he was a man of power. There really only was one choice here. So he plotted to pretty much have Uriah killed in battle. He writes this letter to Joab, his commander, saying, go attack the strongest part of the city, and in the middle of the battle, pull back. I don't know if you guys ever played this game as a kid. I know we did, where we went doorbell dinging or throwing eggs at cars. And it was this plot where we were going to all go up and do it together, but there was that one kid who agreed to ring the doorbell who wasn't in on the plot. And what was going to happen is right before he was about to ring the doorbell, we were going to all flee. And so when he rang the doorbell, he was sitting on the porch all by himself. That's what David said to have happen to Uriah. Go attack the most difficult part of the city. And as the war is going on, pretty much pull back. And hopefully, Uriah will be killed. And so what happens? Verse 16. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger arises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of... I always mess this up. That word. Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. So David pretty much has Uriah carry his death sentence back into war. Joab, his commander, you didn't say no to the king. So he had this plot pretty much executed out, and Uriah dies in war. And now Joab's trying to figure out, how do I communicate this back to the king? And we see a sense of anxiety in the way he crafts this message back. Give him the update on the war, and then he kind of proposes all these questions, anticipating David might ask all these questions. But if his anger arises, then say right at the end, oh yeah, and Uriah the Hittite is dead. So Joab's trying to cover his butt a little bit, because it probably wasn't just Uriah that died in this battle, but probably many of David's strong men would have died in this battle. And so Joab, his commander, is trying to figure out, how do I communicate this back to the king in a way to soften the blow a little bit of what happened? Imagine how Joab feels. I mean, he was put in this position as the commander of the army, probably because of his strategic battles and the wars that he won. And he prides himself on the fact of keeping his men alive. And here he has to execute the king's command of having some of his strongest men killed in battle. So our fourth scene, verse 22. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gave an advantage over us and came out against us in the field. But we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it. So the messenger tells David what happened, and his response, c'est la vie. Such are the winds of war. Sometimes the sword falls and kills good men, and there's not much we can do about that. He's literally covering up his sin. He has absolutely no compassion, no empathy, no moral compass at the fact that these men died in battle because of his command, all to cover up the fact that he raped and impregnated a woman who wasn't his wife. And he goes on to encourage the messenger to encourage Joab. A good leader always does. He encourages his people, even in the hardest of times. And so he encourages the messenger to tell Joab, this is the way war works. We shall not be dismayed, we shall not be disappointed, but we're going to continue to fight. And so David does his leadership charge and encourages Joab to keep on fighting. And this leads us to our final scene, verse 26. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So David, again, covering things up, goes and takes Bathsheba and brings her back to the palace. Imagine what the people of Israel were saying around the water cooler or the water well, wherever they got their water. Did you hear what David did? Did you hear that he took this woman whose husband died in war and is pregnant, and he's going to take care of her? Man, I wish I was like David. I wish I can be like our king. He has such character and how he takes care of this country. And the people of Israel, he looks out for us, and he took this woman in. Yet God saw the heart of David. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. There was only so much that David could continue to do before God said, I had enough. And as we look at this passage, it's a very different picture than what we've seen from Matt over the last 5 weeks of David. Again, over these last 5 weeks, we've seen this rise of a man who every step of the way was zealous about his following after Yahweh, his following after the law, and was just in complete blessing in everything that he did. But at this point, we see a tipping. We see a tipping point where a man who let this fame, this success, the love of his people begin to go to his head to a point where he allowed sin to come into his life and progress to a point where finally God said, I had enough. And so this morning I want to give you 5 takeaways from this passage. Never easy talking about sin in church. And yet, the reality is, it needs to be talked about. Number 1, sin is a process. You see, when David saw Bathsheba, he could have stopped, but he inquired. When David found out who she was, he could have again stopped, but he sent for her. When David called out for her, he could have not slept with her, but he raped her. When David was standing face to face with her husband, he could have confessed, but instead, he plotted. When David's plan to have Uriah sleep with his wife failed, he could have admitted his sin. Instead, he continued to plot to have him killed. When David's plan for Uriah's death eventually came to success, he could have confessed to the Lord. Instead, he was seen as an honorable man for taking in his wife. There's a progression here. And every step of the way, David had a choice. He had a choice as to how far he was going to let this sin go. And the scriptures are very clear that guard our hearts. Matt talks about this all the time. Guard our hearts. You know, we want to look in the mirror and we want to say we're good people. And we want to compare ourselves. Oh man, I didn't do what David did, right? But the reality is the conditions of our heart are tainted. And when our heart is tainted, eventually our actions will follow. And that's what we see here in David. We don't read it in this passage, but there was something going on in David's heart. He had all the success in the world. He had a people that loved him, but his heart was tarnished. And he let that go to a point where his actions followed. And the scriptures tell us that our hearts, whether we want to believe it or not, are tainted. And we have to guard our hearts through the study of the Word, through the various aspects of Christianity, through the Holy Spirit that allows us to let our hearts become more conformed to Christ. Because if we don't, what comes out of our hearts will be sin. And sin progresses. And every step of the way, we have a choice of whether we allow it to continue. Number 2. What's number 2? Sin comes when the tide is low. I did some studying on high tide, low tide on this passage, and if you ever lived on the coastal area, and you know, I mean, people know exact time and when high tide and low tide happens. And the reason being, because when it's high tide, obviously the water's coming in, and potentially the beach that you might be on, or even coming as far up into your property, it has an impact on what you can do. And then when the tide is low, you're able to go back out and enjoy the beach. And over these last 5 weeks, there's one thing that I believe was consistent in every one of these stories that Matt preached, and that was that David had adversity. There was adversity, whether he was tending the sheep and fighting off the lions that were trying to kill him, whether he was being ridiculed by his brothers for being chosen as the next king, whether he was fighting Goliath, whether he was trying to deal with Saul and his craziness, eventually having to run from him. David had adversity after adversity. And when the tide is high, we have this adversity in our life. We're constantly on our toes. But we see at the beginning of this chapter, things were looking pretty good for David. The nation of Israel was powerful. They were winning war after war. Last week we heard that the people were praising David. Saul killed his thousands. David killed his 10,000s. Everybody began to love David, and the nation of Israel was prospering. And you see, he kind of set back on his laurels. The tide was low. And sometimes we have to realize that adversity we have in our lives is really the one thing that's keeping us from sin. We often pray, God, take this thing away from me. And Paul said it in 1 Corinthians. I prayed to God 3 times to take away this thorn in my flesh. And what did God say back to him? My grace is sufficient for you. Because sometimes it's when the tide gets low and life gets a little easy that we find ourselves opening up to sin. That's what we saw here with David. He got too comfortable, and he allowed sin to come into his life. And so we have to remember, when that challenge is in our lives, I get it. I've been there. People of Hope Crossing, we've been there. We've prayed for each other through challenging times. But sometimes we have to just shift focus a little bit. God, maybe don't take this away from me, but let your grace be sufficient for me to work my way through this. Number 3, sin is no respecter of belief. The scriptures are clear. When we come to faith in Jesus Christ, Holy Spirit comes upon us, and there's this process that we call sanctification. And this process where we become more Christ-like and the Holy Spirit works in us. Yet, I think from this passage we see again the contrast between David, the man of Israel, and Uriah the Hittite. I think we have to be careful. Just because we're of the faith doesn't mean that sin's not knocking on our door. And sometimes we get a little too focused on the sins of others, we lose sight of the sins of ours. Sometimes the church, particularly here in America, we've gotten a little too focused on the sins of the world, we've lost sight of our own sins. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week as Nathan confronts David. How do we confront the sin in the church? Because Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 5, it's not our job to judge the world. It's our job to take the gospel message of love to the world. Our job is to make sure our own house is in order. And so just because we're of the faith doesn't mean sin can't come knocking on our door. Number 4, sin desires to put you on the throne. Many times when this passage is preached, it's about lust. And no doubt David had a lust for Bathsheba. I'm going to throw this quote out at you, and it's a little wordy, but hang with me. By universal consent, the deed of David here recorded is regarded as a great sin, a very great sin, because it was a breach of the commandment which guards the purity of human life, and because committed by one blessed with more than ordinary privileges, and in an abuse of regal authority over a probable unsuspicious subject. The deed is ever base and criminal, but that such a man should commit the crime when God was prospering him in all his affairs, when his people were bravely risking their lives in defense of their country, and after he had spent so long and blessed a life in fellowship with God, is one of the marvels and mysteries of human nature. Why would David do this? Again, he was completely blessed. He had everything. The nation of Israel loved him. The nation was prospering. They were winning war after war. And at the peak of that time, he goes off and chases after this woman, rapes her, impregnates her, and then goes down this path of having her husband killed. Why would he do that? Because the reality is that, David probably had a lust problem. But David really had a throne room problem. See, David wanted to take Yahweh off his throne, and David wanted to put himself on his own throne. And that's what happens when we find ourselves caught in sin. Yeah, it's a lust problem, it's an anger problem, it's an anxiety problem, it's all these problems, but in reality, it's a throne room problem. See, God says, I will be your king. Let me sit on the throne of your heart. And when we take God off and say, no, God, I think I know what's best, we open ourselves up for sin. And that's what David did. He got to the point where he had everything, but it wasn't enough. And he wanted to take Yahweh off the throne room of his heart, and he wanted to put himself and say, I think I know what's best. And that just led him into sin. And number 5, the good news of the day. Matt Chandler, in a series that he preached, says there is no good news without bad news. Number 5, sin has a savior. You see, God looked down on David in this ugliness, and as he watched him make decision after decision, said, I still have a plan for you. God looked down at Paul Petroski and said, I see your ugliness, and I have a plan for you. God looked down at each and every one of us and said, even in the midst of the ugliness of your sin, I have a plan for you. And he sent Jesus Christ to die on the cross. He knew, even in the midst of our sinfulness, his love for us was so great that he couldn't leave us in that condition. And so he sent his son and said, I'm giving sin a Savior, and his name is Jesus. And over these next 2 weeks, we're going to dig into that a little bit more. As David gets confronted by Nathan in chapter 12. And then in Psalm 51, we see David just pour his heart out to God. He recognizes the reality of his sins. He says, against you and only you, God, have I sinned. And he pours his heart out to God. And today in this world of New Testament Christianity, each and every one of us has been given that opportunity. Matt talked about it last week. When we stand up there and we're confronted with God, and we can sit here and rattle off all the good things we did, and we can say, hey, God, did you see what David did? I'm not as bad as him. But in reality, what we're supposed to say is, I'm with him. I'm with Jesus. Because no matter how ugly our sinfulness is, Jesus came so that we may be saved. And so this morning, we're going to celebrate that. We're going to celebrate that with what we call communion. And that's our opportunity to come to the table, to eat of the bread and the juice, which is a representation of the death and blood shed by Jesus Christ.